But I really appreciate you coming out, because to me, you know, conservation work is hard, but this, I know people showed up tonight because you love wildlife, and it's just so great to see such support for wildlife, especially Yosemite
I
wildlife.
can't hear. She's
Louder. I turned it up. Oh, that's on.
Is it on now?
Oh,
There we go.
yeah.
Okay. So thank you for coming out for wildlife. And also it's a treat for me because Rob and I have been doing a lot of separate talks, so I think it's one of the first ones we've done together, so it's really great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea for the book, the creation, and then Rob is going to get into his incredible photography, which just elevates the work so much. You know, the photos themselves tell a story, which I love. But yeah, I worked for this photo. Just want these books are 6 pounds, I think, each. So carrying these up the mountain, I was like, this is not a field guide. But I wanted to start out with this great video I got to let you know that Yosemite Wildlife is PICA approved. And what you couldn't hear, since we don't have audio, is the PICA did do a little meet. But it's so great to be here tonight. You know, we had an in-park celebration scheduled when it first came out, which because of the shutdown got canceled, which I'm not venting about. I mean, you know, the poor park rangers, obviously that was the bigger problem. But we haven't had, you know, much a chance to celebrate. I'm about to do 4 book signings in a row, but this is really the first big one. So thanks for celebrating with us. You know, for me, this has been a 30-year dream to do this book. And it started with this coyote right here. This is, in 1992, December 20th, my first visit to Yosemite National Park ever. And it was one of those perfect scenes. So I had moved to California. I had, you know, read books as a kid and always wanted to come to Yosemite. And it was just the perfect day. It was snowing. You know, it was like a rom-com. But my suitor was not Tom Hanks or whatever. It was this coyote. And it was magical. You know, I always longed for, here's actually the book that as a child, I would read and I'd make this list of national parks I wanted to visit and work in, and I achieved that dream. I worked in Yosemite. I worked in Yosemite for 9 years, in Yellowstone National Park. I do work in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area with wildlife crossings. So national parks have been sort of this moral compass for me for a long time. But it really was that first visit where I saw things. I'd never seen a coyote in the wild. Right? Growing up in Massachusetts, we did not have big animals back then. Now they've come back. But the best I could hope for was my mom, who's here with me tonight. Let's give my mom a hand to help. But you know, she'd feed the birds, and we saw squirrels and birds and frogs. So that coyote captured my imagination, and it really was then, as I was making a snowman in the valley and looking at this landscape, which I just couldn't, as an East Coaster, get my head around. But it was that coyote that I came back to. I wrote in my journal about the coyote and that I wanted to write a book about Yosemite's wildlife, and said I would not trade anything for the sight of that coyote. You know, that coyote really didn't know what he inspired. I even made a homemade book on the wildlife after that. But I knew I wasn't ready to write the book, right? I needed experience. I needed to learn more. And that's where I stumbled on Joseph Grinnell and Tracy Storr's Bible, or what I call my Bible. Animal Life in the Yosemite. This is one of my most treasured possessions. And this book was written in 1924. Amazingly, what I discovered back then was another one had not been published since. There are many incredible books about Yosemite that have wildlife in them, but there was no book solely dedicated to parks wildlife since that book. So those two happenstances merged. I wanted to capture the wonder of that moment of that coyote and learn more about the park's wildlife and write a book. It merged with my goal of, wait a minute, Yosemite wildlife deserve an update. They deserve a voice. And here's some photos from the book. And what was great about Grinnell is he was a scientist, and I'll get into that, but he also told a lot of great stories, which is what I captured in my book as well, which I'll talk about. But he even, at the time, noted that there wasn't a lot of books written about Yosemite wildlife. And I just find this really puzzling why we ignore the wildlife in the park like Yosemite, but I think it is because it's easy to get lost in the grandeur of a half dome around Capitan and forget that that is also someone's home. I also worked in Yellowstone where the wildlife's in your face, there's no ignoring it. And there's hundreds of books, thousands of books about Yellowstone wildlife because I think it's so prominent. But we have incredible biodiversity here, but I think it gets lost in the scenery. So I knew I couldn't just write the book at age 22. And so this has been a 30-year quest. And Grinnell, to write Animal Life in Yosemite, he embarked with a whole team on the the Yosemite Transect from 1914 to 1920, and that's all his stats. And I am happy to note I surpassed them, except for the specimens. I did not kill anything. That was a troubling trend back then, is any wildlife you saw, you killed to put in the museum. I did take some pica poop samples. And then the only other thing I added to it was, I'm sure he did not have 588 mobile station margaritas on his survey, which I feel bad that they didn't have that to fall back on. But this was 30 years of observing, of taking notes, which I knew, again, the book, the 100-year update couldn't just be a couple years of research. Some of this research gets really fun. This was the 2023 year, and you have to work for it to see pika and toads early. And we hit the 2023 Sun Cup, which literally went viral. I'll tell you, that was the hardest Sun Cup navigation I've ever done after 30 years of hiking in the Sierra. And I just start out with my love of Yosemite, and a lot of the wildlife I study, and where I spend a lot of my time in the summer, is these high elevation. If you get to the high country chapter in there, my love for this landscape and the animals will be most evident if I had to pick favorites. But this is where I'm spending a lot of my time, and a lot of the stories come from. But also, all the way down to El Portal, to Wawona. And over this time, and this is probably even more because I don't have photos to go back to iNaturalist, but the Sierra Nevada observations, 32,900 species. I am the #1 observer in the country of mule deer, Belgian ground squirrels, Sierra newts. I mean, it's a lot of observations, but those observations aren't just data points, they're stories, and they're watching the animals behave and learning about the animals in the context of their environment and their homes. Also, a lot of library research. Yes, the Yosemite Research Office still has these. It's really amazing to see. It is really fun to look at the card catalog. And there's a wealth of just archival material in there that I'm so grateful when I, push the Yosemite Conservancy, you need to include this. And I'll talk about the Conservancy investing in this, because some of this stuff had never been published before. Some of it I don't even think people had looked at for a long time. It's quite amazing what's in there. This is a great poem, most of you know, if you came to my talk last year, which I talked a lot about the animals. This time I have some animals, it's more about what the book is about. But my favorite is the pika, and I love this poem. It's hilarious. This was in some of the field school notes. Looking at the original journals of people like Joseph Dixon, George Middleton Wright, Grinnell was really fascinating to dive into. Enid Michael, who is the first woman official park naturalist in the park, lived in Yosemite Valley. And then these wildlife observation cards that literally, I can't believe what's in there, some historic figures, and again, pushing in the Yosemite Conservancy agreeing to print up a lot of these. We ended up again with a 400-page book, which is not cheap, but they invested because it was so important to document some of these. We have wildlife sightings in these archives going back to the 20s. And then Yosemite Nature Notes, having that, we are the only park that has this incredible, archive of sightings and observations in the sort of a periodical form that dates back, to the 20s. So it was rich in material to mine for the book. And again, a lot of this stuff people weren't aware was there. So it was really wonderful to be able to bring out those stories. And then what also happened as I was writing this book over the years is they decided to resurvey the Grinnell Transect, which again is how he intended his work to be used. So not only did I have the data from the Grinnell book, but now we have this resurvey that gives another point in time to compare the baseline. And the book does go into some of the findings and the comparisons and that. The other things I did, a lot of interviews. It was wonderful to talk to folks, park rangers, scientists, Yvonne Chenard from Patagonia, social media influencers, just folks who had a connection to Yosemite, but most importantly, those who were working to protect and conserve the wildlife. And I even did social media polls over the years, like, there was one from 2019, hey, what's the coolest bird you like? And really got people talking about what they'd like to see in a Yosemite book. So that was really fun. My favorite poll was the rock climbers. Hey, what do you see up there? And I was blown away. Snakes 1,000 feet up. I didn't guess that. It's amazing what those guys are encountering. And that led me to really discovering the ecology of cliff life, which that was one thing. I learned a lot from the book. As much as 30 years of observations, when I really started diving into the research, there was a lot of Yosemite wildlife that I didn't even know was there, or where the wildlife were making their homes. The other thing about this book that I really wanted to make sure got translated well was there's a heck of a lot of science in this book. I am a scientist. It's not my day job, but I do research on my own and on some papers. But science is important. But I didn't want it to be a science book. I wanted it to be those books of wonder and discovery that I read as a kid and that led me into the wildlife and led me to become a scientist. And so these were sort of some of the tone and writing of what we were trying to emulate. And I shared with the Conservancy a lot of these for early design considerations and for content. The other thing you'll notice is I do not call wildlife its. They get pronouns. They get talked about because they are beings like we are, and I think we're past that. So anthropomorphizing, storytelling, that is now being widely used. The science is even showing us that these animals have rich lives that we can compare them to, even if they're not exact. So that was another kind of aim and ambition for me, that this had to tell the stories of the wildlife almost through their voices and places. And I think Obi Kaufman, my friend, really captured that. So, here's the ultimate table of constants. I can tell you this took years to figure out. I mean, Grinnell included over 700 species, and he didn't even do invertebrates and insects and spiders. But this just took years of all the stuff I showed you, surveys, really thinking about it. And what I really focused on was either animals that were uniquely Yosemite, so some of the endemics we'll talk about, or animals that had a unique story in Yosemite, even if they were common, like bears or deer. A Yosemite bear is different than a bear living down in LA or living on the coast. But it was tough. It was really tough to fix this. And it was also tough to kind of structure it. What were the sections going to be? And that's where I came up with about 5 basics, which included the archival, interviews, things like that. But it was wonderful to see the puzzle piece finally come together, and this is the final table of contents. And that's what's been magic. Again, this talk, unlike, again, the talk I did last year, which was just about the animals, this is sort of the insight of how this came together. And it's amazing to go back to my 1992 journal where I'm like, I'm going to write this book, that coyote, and see what it's become. And obviously, Robb's photos are much better than my amateur eye, in 1992. Or, look at my notebooks over 30 years of writing down this stuff, and not just writing it down, but even writing some early drafts of stories of the animals. And here's an early mock-up I think I did in 2018 of what I kind of wanted for some of these sections, and look at what it became. So it's this, when do we get a chance to work on something with this big a time scale? Right? I've been working on the Wallace Neighborhood Crossing for 14 years, which is a long time. But this, it's just wonderful to see it develop over time. And here's some of the, you're buying the book, but here's some of the incredible, and I just can't say enough good stuff about Eric Hall, the designer, who really did get at what I wanted, which was, don't want it to be a science book, don't want it to be sort of an accessible art, book, but something that would draw you in. And to also include those archival materials, excerpts from Grinnell's book. And the thing that really was most important to me is to ensure that over 100 years, the voices of people who had been working to help protect the wildlife or who love the wildlife in the park came through. So there's a lot of curation that I did to ensure that they were represented over time. And I'll tell you, there's no better bibliography of Sierra wildlife and Yosemite wildlife now. This was a lot. It was my least favorite part, but it was worth it. And that's what went into it. But how did we get to this incredible product? And that's really, first, the Yosemite Conservancy. And I cannot thank them enough for investing in this book. I know I pushed them out of their comfort level a lot. It is a 6-pound, 56-page book. But they early on saw the worth and the vision of making this match, making this a legacy publication. And there was other publishers interested. Some didn't want to do as many photos, some didn't want it as big, but without them, we would just have kind of another, wildlife field guide or something. So just can't thank them enough for their investment. They saw that this was needed. And then of course, Robb, who in other talks, talk a little more about his photography, but you have him here. I had, for most of the time I'd been working on this book, I just thought I'd use multiple photographers and pick the best photo. But for Robb's incredible book, which I'm sure you all have, he had invited me to write a pica essay. And I had already been shopping around some publishers, and I remember thinking, geez, I wonder if Robb would have enough photos to do all of them. And so I reached out, and happily he agreed, because I think we can all agree he's an incredibly talented photographer. That, again, we were talking about this to somebody tonight. He's not just a photographer, he's a biologist taking photos. And that in itself elevates it to not just getting that remarkable photo, but telling a story, which again is the perfect match for this book. So I was really happy when he agreed, and again, the Conservancy then, not only was it from his library, but gave him 2 years to get some custom photos. And I think he captured almost everything, except for some of the harder, you weren't going to get a Mount Lyell shrew, but, almost everything. But he'll talk about his photography as well, but just really happy to have his work included, and that really elevates the book. And then again, it takes a village to, over 30 years, look at telling fully the story, from scientists to park interpreters to people even in other parks, Yellowstone and others, talking about wildlife. So I'm just going to end with a few sort of, again, last time I told more of the stories of the wildlife, but it's just such an honor, and I hope Grinnell would have been proud of this update, but here's kind of Grinnell's take, and here's ours. Here's Grinnell's take on the Mount Lyell salamander. Here's ours. Here's the Mount Lyell shrew. Again, 2 endemics that you won't find anywhere else. And here's, this is one of the few photos in the book that is not Robb's, but we were able to squeeze this in. First photo live ever of this animal, and it was done in early 2025. Yosemite toad, another incredible endemic. Again, I told the stories of these animals last time, and if you weren't here last time, you can now read about the book, but here's the update. And I am not a photographer. I take photos to record, but this is one of my few photos in the book. I was able to capture a toad on snow, but they're such a remarkable animal that only exists here in the Sierra that we should be proud of. The gray owl, this is one of my favorite photos of Robb's too. So it was just so great to have this time scale and to compare, then and now. And then some of the animals we might consider more common, but they have stories in Yosemite that are different, like the mule deer, or like the mule deer, the bear, things like that. So these are the updates. I really hope you enjoy this story. And then I think I have, I have a few minutes. I thought if I had some time, I would tell a few stories from the book. Since last time it was all animal stories, I didn't want to do none. But there's some few favorite stories I include in the book. The first is this barring owl. This photo is not in the book, but it was in 2024. I was hiking late, it was September, hiking up near Gala Lake Space Ground, it's about 11,000 feet. And I'd seen a prairie falcon earlier, and I was walking up and I see this bird in a tree fly, literally almost clipped me. And I said, oh, it must be the prairie falcon. And all of a sudden, the bird landed, started doing this and looked at me. I'm like, well, that's not a falcon. Is that a burrowing owl? Indeed it was, which is so rare, not just in Yosemite, but in the Sierra. And there was only one other recorded sighting at that high elevation in Yosemite, which oddly enough was the same day and month as mine. So I don't know if that owl was hanging around for 50 years, but they were 50 years apart. And that's one of the things I love, you saw the field time I'm out there. That's, again, the luxury of being out there and being on the landscape and paying attention and having that time to see both changes in the environment, but rare things that, if you're just there once a year, doesn't appear. My other favorite story in the book is from the archives, where there was an old horny. Back then they could call animals that without any embarrassment. That George Mendelsohn Wright, who, I could write a whole book on him, and indeed there is a whole book on him. He was the founder of Yosemite Wildlife Research. And this is a deer in the valley that had a third antler. And he was very popular. They wrote a lot of nature notes about him, and then he died of old age. I think it was a year after this. And George wrote in one of these articles, we shall put his antlers into the museum, and he shall not be lost to history. And when I was writing the book, went in there to the archives and asked the archive folk, it was probably one of the stranger questions they'd gotten, where's Old Horny? And he wasn't in their system, and I'm like, well, he's got to be here. I mean, my God, I don't think the museum would throw it away. And indeed, we walked through the warehouse. It was kind of like that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark with all these boxes, and we found him. And so here's Old Horny. And if I have one mission, it's to get Old Horny back in the museum. And then I'll end with some bear stories, because who doesn't love bears? But one of the things I uncovered was this bear who climbed royal arches. Can you see the bear there? That's the thing is, but yeah, right there. Isn't that insane? Oh, that's the point of thing. So this is what I love, uncovering these stories through over time and research. And the bear made it. They went back and looked, and he didn't die. He somehow got back up. But it was quite a story to uncover that a bear had actually tried some rock climbing. And then last year, they found evidence of a bear on Half Dome. So I guess they try to rock climb with the best of them. And this is also a story I recount in the book. This is on the Kuna Crest, and one of my favorite places to hike. It's so remote, nobody's, you just don't see anybody else there, but you see a lot of bears, and wild bears, not the ones breaking into cars. And so they get to be kind of free of people and those, the food influences. And this was a bear where, I'm walking up this creek, up to Kuna Lake, and I'm looking at scat, and it's getting fresher and fresher, and I'm kneeling at the last one. This bear must be around somewhere, and I look up, and there he is. And he's like, yep. And then he, with his little pajama bottom feet, went on his way. And then this is a bear I watched crossing Gala Lake. I actually opened the book with one year when I was watching Pika, and talk about just a magical moment that, kind of takes you out of your humanness and back to a time where wildlife really dominated the landscape, the bigness of this scene. Amazing. There it is. So I'll conclude with, before we get to Robb's talk about his photos, that, I think what I hope this book does is what Grinnell hoped his book was do. This is the update to his, and he knew that the value of his book would be 100 years from now, which we could make comparisons, we could look at the science, these stories wouldn't be lost. And that's what I'm aiming for, is to both elevate the work he did, but also make those comparisons so we know how to protect, inspire people to protect the wild world. this wildlife does need a voice. And I will say, although this is a book of hope, as someone who's been doing conservation now my whole life, since I was even a kid, I'm terrified. I've never seen anything like it. Our parks used to be bipartisan. Nixon passed the Endangered Species Act. Gerald Ford was a park ranger. Ronald Reagan worked with Governor Newsom's dad to protect mountain lions. I don't know what happened. But we are standing on a time where this could all be lost. And I don't want my book to become a chronicle of what we gave up. We are really on the verge of some biodiversity collapse. This is not fear-mongering, this is science. And so I do hope this book and the stories in it really inspire people to first know what's in these parks, and then work to protect them. And also realize that the wildlife in these books is not just in the parks. These are the wildlife in our backyards. Wildlife don't know national park borders. And if we are not protecting the mountain lions and the monarch butterflies in Yosemite, we're not going to have them in our own backyards. So I hope these stories of wild wonder inspire you, and I hope they inspire others to make sure that our parks stay protected. Because after all, as I put in the book, Half Dome is beautiful to look at, but it is somebody's home. Thank you so much, and I will turn it over to Robb. And just want to, again, we will stay after and sign as many books as you want.
That was great, Beth. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. First off, it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. I love our foothill communities. This is a great turnout. Thank you all so much for coming. Big shout out to STCHS. I was super impressed with all the programs they put on, and we're always happy to support them in any way possible. So we really love having them in our community. It's a wonderful organization. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little about the wildlife images in the book. First of all, I do want to thank Beth for asking me to partner on the project. We've both been doing analogous work in the park for 30 years in different ways, but both looking at the wildlife and the ecology and the conservation and stuff like that. So when she asked me to partner on this book, I was thrilled. It was a great way. I've always wanted to do a wildlife book in conjunction with the other one. And, our visions were similar, and it ended up being a really unique collaboration, and really unlike any other book that we've seen out there. A couple things about my photography that I'd like to point out, kind of right at the very beginning. Beth alluded to it a little bit. I really try to tell stories with the wildlife images. So although there are some just portraits of animals, the idea is to put the animal in the context of its environment, or doing something behaviorally that helps to spark intrigue, interest, as well as to tell the story of the actual animals. Ideally, in my wildlife photography opportunities, the animals don't even know I'm there. Right? I really try very hard to not disturb animals from their natural behaviors. And a bunch of different techniques to do that, which I can go over a little bit, and we can talk about later. But it's really important not to affect their biology. There's some pretty unethical nature photographers out there, and birders, that I have a real problem with, that I'm trying to teach those folks how to do these kinds of things without having such a big impact. And so I strive, and I really try to promote and let people know that these images, even close-up images, are either the camera trap, or moving far away, or blind, so the animals are really doing their natural behaviors. And the other thing about my photography is, as much as I'd love to sell big fine art prints to put on the wall, or just pure pleasure, ultimate goal with my imagery is to use it for conservation, outreach, and education, so that ideally, the more people understand and know about and appreciate the natural world, the more likely we and they are to make decisions that benefit the natural world, rather than just ourselves. And so, tying all those things in together is really why I'm a nature photographer. So, when people think of Yosemite, right, the first visualization is the majestic icons, right? El Capitan, the amazing waterfalls, the phenomenon of Horsetail Falls, which is epic. But as a result, and Beth alluded to this as well, the wildlife often gets overlooked and overshadowed. And that's a bummer because there's incredible diversity of wildlife in Yosemite. People think about wildlife parks, you think of Yellowstone, Beth was working, or the Grand Tetons, where there's megafauna everywhere. The bison and the elk and the wolves really take precedent, and that's what people think of there. But in reality, there's more mammal diversity in Yosemite than in Yellowstone. Yosemite has 90 species of mammals, and Yellowstone has about 65. And Yellowstone is nearly 3 times the size of Yosemite. So you put that in perspective, it's amazing the diversity of the wildlife in Yosemite, and the reason why this wildlife book is so important. River otters. So they're pretty rare in the park, and not seen very often, but there's a few areas where they have taken up residence and are there year-round. This was in Yosemite Valley. They are there periodically for as much as they are there. They're still so rarely seen. I typically see them more in the mid-elevation lakes in the park. And I had a pretty phenomenal experience with one of these otters. So I was photographing along the Merced River in the valley. I heard a big splash around the corner of the bend up ahead, and a wake started coming my way, a little wave. My immediate reaction was to jump behind a tree and hide my presence. And only moments later, I saw this otter swimming upriver towards me with a huge fish in his mouth. Right? And I hauled out on this log and started working on it. The first thing it did was chomp on the tail of the fish. And I'm thinking to myself, this is weird, right? That's the least nutritious part of the fish. Why is it doing that, right? Until the fish gave a huge lurch, got out of the grasp of the otter, and is floating in the water and tries to swim. But it's got no tail to swim. It can't go anywhere. The otter casually reaches down, grabs the fish, looks at it like, what do you think, little fishy? And then proceeds to chomp on the rest of it. And it was just those kinds of interactions. You know, I read about that, but to see it is pretty cool. And this is an image of the otter. Actually, she went on its tail. Oops, wrong button. I've got to get my little pointer. So you can see that's the tail, and the head is down here. So it's just absolutely destroyed the tail before I work on the rest of the fish. So I've been asked a lot recently, my favorite image in the book, or my favorite wildlife encounter. That's really hard to say. I can't say there's any one, but this is always near the top. These are Yosemite toads. They occur and breed in the high elevation areas of the park. This is about 10,500 feet. And they breed in these shallow pools of water that are fed by snowmelt. Those pools of water don't last very long, only a few inches deep. And during that small window of time, the males come out, and so I know these are 2 males. This is not a male and a female getting frisky, like I'm sure plenty of you thought. This is 2 males wrestling. And so they come into these shallow pools of water, and they jump on each other back and wrestle. So there's one male trying to shove the other one's head under the water. So they make space and vocalize to draw on the females. And I'm lying in the mud, 20 feet away, watching these toads brawl and wrestle, and I'm like, this is the most amazing, natural wildlife encounter. You don't have to have a grizzly encounter to have a really cool, amazing mutual, wild kingdom moment. And this is mine with a couple of Yosemite toads. Another amazing thing about them is they're wild, right? So these shallow pools of water are so short-lived that when the eggs are laid and fertilized, within 10 to 12 days, those eggs hatch into tadpoles. And only 2 months later, those tadpoles evolve into the baby toads. Incredibly fast reproduction, really unique because of their habitat. Another amazing, interesting reproductive strategy is that of the killdeer. And these are really widespread birds. They nest down here in Groveland, have a nest on our property here in Groveland, as well as up near 9,000 feet in Tuolumne Meadows. And they're ground nesting birds, and this is a nest exchange. So if you look carefully, you can see there's 4 eggs in a nest on the ground that are super well camouflaged. And they have this interesting reproductive strategy. It's called when the eggs are incubated for a prolonged period of time. For these guys, it's about a month. Usually, eggs are incubated for a couple of weeks among most birds, the size at least. And because of that long incubation period, when the eggs hatch, the young are called precocial, meaning that they, within hours of hatching, are running around and feeding themselves. The adults never feed the young. So this is taken literally just hours. There's 2 chicks in here. We've got one that's maybe 3 or 4 hours old, and this one just hatched. So it's still wet, it's staying protected underneath the adult bird. And then I was watching this whole progress, and by the end of the day, so within hours of hatching, these little birds are running around, feeding themselves. It's chaos all around. The adults are trying to find them, keep them all, from going off too far. And by the end of the afternoon, the young are following the adults off and running around. You never see them again. It still takes them several weeks before they can fly, but they're pretty much on their own. So here's the adult with the young that's probably 7 hours old, really just mobile, running around doing its own thing. This is probably one of the most challenging images to get for the book. This is a fisher, and they are both rare, they're super elusive, really shy. There's only maybe 100 to 300 individuals in this isolated population in Sierra Nevada. They're considered an endangered species as a result. And for this, I worked with the national park biologists with their research protocol to set up my camera traps in and amongst theirs. So they've got little trail cams they use to monitor species. They added me to their permit so I could use my nicer camera trap gear to photograph them. And just a quick explanation of camera trap. One of the ones I use is a nice camera that's in a pelican box, a waterproof pelican box that I've modified. The lens can pop through, and it's got a passive infrared trigger, so it's a heat detection trigger that triggers the animal. And then if it's nocturnal or nighttime stuff, I'll use flashes and stuff like that. This one was set up during the day to capture this fisher. And then for some of the really sensitive nocturnal species, and this is near a den, so we want to be really careful, I had the camera converted infrared. And you can put filters over flashes, so the flash that comes through at night is just a really dull red that doesn't bother any of these nocturnal animals. So that's why this one's black and white, because the IR image is rendered as kind of a red tone, so you convert it to a black and white. But the point of me saying that is, in these sensitive situations, there's other images, you'll see it's using this infrared technology so that I'm not disturbing the animals. A couple of cool things about fishers. Well, there's a bunch of cool things, but one of them in particular is they are able to rotate their back legs 180 degrees. They can be facing upward or downward, allowing them to walk down a tree trunk head first. And that enables them to hunt predator or hunt prey that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do, and it's surprising. It's a really unique adaptation that these guys have. They're actually known in some areas to be porcupine specialists, because they can attack a porcupine from above. Crazy. Ouch, yeah. Lots of bobcats around. Bobcats are really common, right? But they're pretty elusive. At least I find in Groveland, in a lot of areas, it's exciting and they move on, but they're not easy to observe. Whereas in Yosemite Valley, they become so used to people that, in fact, maybe too used to people sometimes, so they walk right up to folks. But it allows for some really amazing wildlife encounters and opportunities. This next one is probably one of the highlights of anything that I've seen. So another day I was in Yosemite Valley walking around with my camera gear. And through a bunch of shrubs, I noticed a bobcat that was stalking. It was super keyed in on something. It was focused on. And I could see through another area of shrubs that it was after was a couple of ground squirrels that were taking a dust bath. And, you know, the initial thought process might be to, if I moved into a different position, I would have been able to watch this incredible, you know, hunt that was about to happen. But I was afraid if I moved at all, I would disturb the ground squirrel, ending the hunt, screwing everything up. So I just stayed where I was, and I could just do obscured through vegetation, see the bobcat moving closer, closer. All of a sudden, there's dust flies up, the squeal of a dying rodent, right? And even at that point, I'm like, well, if I move around, I can photograph it. But I didn't want to, again, have an impact on this bobcat's hunting. So I stayed where I was. I kind of gave up on the opportunity until it was walking kind of away from me with the ground squirrel, and I'm sorry, with the gray squirrel, and it just came around the tree trunk and glanced back at me. And it was like, I can't see whether it was, you know, like, oh, you caught me, you know, or thanks for not disturbing my hunt, whatever it was. It feels like it's kind of the epitome of a bobcat doing its thing. Not a lot of Canada geese in Yosemite, but there are a couple of mid-elevation lakes they do nest at. And I spent 3 or 4 days at one of those lakes paddling around, photographing the wildlife I could find. And I was paddling a canoe by a little island, and I noticed this goose was nesting right on the edge of the island. And as I paddled by, it really wasn't disturbed by me. Maybe it's because I was in a boat, or else just didn't mind me, didn't have any behaviors that was disturbed. So I had this idea. And I set up my camera on a tripod, had all the settings all dialed in. And as I paddled by that, I left the camera on the tripod nearby, and then I paddled to the other side of the island and hit out. And I had a remote, so I could watch the bird, see what it was doing, and then take a few frames whenever it was moving or something interesting was happening. And late in the afternoon, this beautiful light came through, and the goose kind of moved up just to adjust. It's settling in the nest a little bit, and it was just kind of beautiful light. And the coolest thing was right at the very end of the day, on the last light on the goose, it reached down with its long neck and rotated all of the eggs in the nest so that they would be incubated in the same temperature for the same time period, so they'll hatch at the same time. Again, something I've read about as a biologist over all the years, but actually just even photograph it. We just think about how careful that goose has to be with its head and its neck to reach underneath and to be able to move those eggs around. Super, super cool. One of my big goals for images for the book was to capture an image of a bat in flight, which, as you can imagine, can be really, really challenging. And I got a tip from Park Service biologists about a bat roost, a lot of bats underneath the Briceburg Bridge, which is just outside of Yosemite. So I drove down with all my gear and checked it out, and the setup was really quite good attention to get an image of a bat in flight, because for them to come in and out of the roost, they had to come through a relatively narrow area. And so I set up a camera on a tripod. I have a different kind of trigger. It's a LiDAR trigger that can capture super fast moving animals. I set that up. I set up a couple of strobes nearby. And I set up a chaise lounge chair with a sleeping bag right nearby underneath the bridge. So all night long, I'm making adjustments to the settings, and then cars are hauling over the bridge, and I'm hoping a cop doesn't come and say, what's this guy doing with all this electronic gear underneath the bridge? and come morning, I looked at all the images, nothing useful, not even anything close. Out of focus, no bats in the frame, I was super frustrated. So I just wanted to get up, look at these little buggers, like eluding me all night. So I climbed up on the piling underneath the bridge. Crawl on my back through a little bit of bat guano to kind of get a look directly up into the roost, and that's what I was looking at. This group of Mexican free-tailed bats, all packed in there, sandwiched during the day, until they come out at night and go after insects. And just the way they're all stacked in there is super cute. I don't, these aren't things I normally kind of throw out there. I keep a lot of stuff myself, but this image was kind of in the very final round of judging for the BBC's International Wildlife Photography Competition, whatever it is, like pretty much the top wildlife photography competition out there. This was nearly a winner. but to be even in that category was pretty special. So I failed that night getting images of a bat in flight, but I returned a few weeks later and caught that guy. And one of the cool things is that those last bats I showed, this is going in the same roost as those last bats. The last ones I showed were Mexican free-tailed bats. And this is a canyon myotis. And didn't even know that he was going in there unless I did a little photograph and get him identified with some bat experts. But it is known that some of these bats, different species, will share roosts like that. Bears, right? How can we not have a bear in the Yosemite slideshow / book? And I swapped this one out for a bear taken locally. So this is on our property in Groveland. Again, with a camera trap. That's why the bears are in front of the camera with flashes. Flashes really don't disturb bears at all. The only problem with camera trapping bears is they tend to eat camera traps. So all of my camera traps have like mad tooth marks and claw marks. They've all been really destroyed with the scent. They're known, of all camera trappers, bears are known to be really curious, to put it mildly and nicely. Another camera trap image from our property. So from here on out, I'm going to go a little quicker through the animal. I'm not going to tell as many longer stories. I wanted to give a broader overview of the diversity of the critters that we cover in the book. This gray fox is also here in Grove on our property with the camera trap and flashes. And for full disclosure, right, I had the composition all set up. So I left the trees and the backdrop and everything. But the rain and the full moon coming through the clouds, I did not plan. Right? So I kind of got lucky there. You got to get a bit of luck with a little bit of work, and that's kind of how that one all came together. This is one of the other very challenging images to photograph, or animals to photograph, a ringtail. Pretty rare, really elusive, nocturnal, challenging to find and to photograph, but they are some of the most remarkable, interesting, related to raccoons, of animals in the park. This is in the Merced River Canyon, just inside the park. A black-headed grosbeak at a nest with some chicks in Yosemite Valley. There's a brown creeper doing brown creepers too. So their ecology, they spend a lot of time behind the bark, catching insects or nesting back there. And again, from a wildlife telling standpoint, this to me image kind of speaks to where they are, what they do. And, this bird peeking its head out of behind the bark where they spend a lot of their time. The great blue heron on the Merced River. This is one of these amazing opportunities where this bird was so still for such a long time. I used a really long shutter speed, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, oops, button, to get this flow of water behind it. And shooting wildlife like that is really rare to get the opportunity where animals can stay still for multiple seconds at a time. So when I get the opportunity, I try to do more creative kinds of photography with them. Rattlesnakes. We have one species of rattlesnake, the Western Pacific, that lives up around here. They're beautiful. I'm a big fan of rattlesnakes. If any of you have an issue with rattlesnakes, or you're worried about them, you find one on your property, you need to get it moved, call me. I'll come and move it. I'll take it somewhere and release it somewhere safe, rather than cutting its head off, please. I would be happy to come out and relocate any rattlesnakes anywhere around here. It's really not hard. I can teach you how to do it. They're really easy to move with the right skills and techniques. Here's a funny one. This is I'm going to save, so I'm probably going to come back and do a longer slideshow some in the future, really, because there's so many stories on all these wildlife images. And I'm going to save the full story of this image for the next time, because it's too long to talk about right now. But it was a really circumstantial situation that I just came across, and it's just, there's no real rhyme or reason to it. It's just a dragonfly landing on a garter snake's head. Pond turtle. So this is kind of a, literally maybe 2 days before we were sending the book off to press. I brought in, like Beth mentioned, there were maybe 20 images I brought in from friends I wasn't able to cover, so I brought in some images from folks that I know. the extra image we had of pond turtles, I wasn't super happy with. And so I got a tip just before the book was going out to be printed about these pond turtles. And so I went out there and had this really cool encounter. And something about pond turtles, right? I mean, if you look at their faces, don't they look at they're smiling, right? They look happy. They've got this upturned part of their mouth. They look like they're joyous. They're super, super cute. Sierra newt, one of the other more remarkable amphibians that we have up in our area. It's a Sierra blue butterfly on a shooting star. Interesting thing about this image is that plant is actually the host plant of that butterfly. So those butterflies will lay their eggs on that shooting star, the eggs hatch, the larvae feed off of the plant, and then they metamorphose into an adult butterfly and they find another shooting star. It's kind of cool to show that whole ecological loop within one image. And aside from that fact, shooting stars are just really, really pretty flowers, in addition to the butterfly. This is another one of those wild kingdom moments. I was walking through a field of flowers, and I noticed there was one butterfly that was hanging upside down on a flower. I'm like, that looks strange, what's going on there? And upon closer inspection, you can see there's a crab spider that had grasped and was eating this butterfly. I'm like, wow, that's great. I set up my camera on a tripod, I'm photographing it, I'm like, this is awesome. Another amazing wildlife encounter. And then the skipper lands on the flower and starts feeding. I'm literally laughing through my camera, going, this is happening right in front of me, the mutual wild kingdom moment on a micro scale, right? And it was super cool. And I've seen handfuls of crab spiders, but not very many of them. A bristlefly. We give a lot of attention to the insects in the book, right? We can't forget about those important parts of our ecosystem. What strikes me about this one is look how haggard its wings are, right? It's really, this one's been through some rough times. And the bristles aren't exactly known. Their ecological purpose for some animals is a defense so animals will eat them. Other times it can be a sensory organ. I did a little research, I don't think we know what this guy exactly what it's for. Right? It wasn't able to find it, but just a super cool looking insect. These are fairy shrimp. Really remarkable organisms. They occur really widespread generally in ephemeral pools of water, right? Water areas of water don't last a really long time. And this is up at almost 11,000 feet up in the high country of the Sierra. And these organisms can survive for many years as a cyst, which is analogous to a seed, basically. And only when conditions come that are appropriate enough water meals, then those cysts hatch into these fairy shrimp en masse, and they fill the pools, swim around, they eat vegetative material, and reproduce. And they just look like alien organisms, right? Like they're from another planet. And there's another really interesting, right, that's a copepod right in there, amongst all the other fairy shrimp. And from my understanding, looking into it, they don't actually know why there's different colors. At least the folks I was talking to. All right, now we're on to some of the really cute critters in the park. There's some baby yellow-bellied marmots up in the high country, some of the most charismatic and fun animals to watch, observe, and photograph. Pika, definitely, Beth's got a special affinity for pika, as I think we all do, because arguably the cutest animal in Yosemite. Here it's bringing some vegetation back to its hay pile, which is stored for the winter. Again, some of the more intriguing, engaging, fun animals to spend time with. This is a golden mantled, don't call me a chipmunk ground squirrel, looking over its territory. And I say that for good reason, because they oftentimes are confused with chipmunks. I'll show you one in a second, the difference. Very common, small mammals up in the high country, this one's again like a more behavioral shot of its doing its sentinel duty. And so you compare the head of the golden mantled ground squirrel to the head of the chipmunk's got stripes through its head. Anybody can tell the difference. What strikes me about this image is I love the tone overlap between the chipmunk and the lichens on the rock. And it's just kind of a beautiful tonal match. All right, well, let's talk about the little mammals. Look at some of the mammal predators. This is a long-tailed weasel, really in that same zone as the marmots and the pikas. Ounce for ounce, one of the, excuse my language, baddest ass predators around. Really ferocious predators for anything up to 1.5 times their size. Super quick. I watched this one run around looking for pikas, going in and out of hay piles for about an hour one day. It was really unique because all the other times I've seen any weasels in the park, they're fleeting, they're fast. Glimpse of it, it takes off, I don't see it again. This one, for some reason, was so intrigued by what was going on. Didn't mind me. It was just running around looking at all these different pike hay piles. There's the predators from the sky. This is a golden eagle at its nest in Yosemite. I've always thought if I could come back as any animal, I think it'd be a golden eagle. To be able to cover the entire Sierra Nevada, they're just so majestic and amazing. I think what's really interesting about this image is the scale. So just keep in mind that this adult bird here, it has maybe a 6 to 7 foot wingspan, right? And it's towering over this chick. And that chick is still probably, I don't know, maybe about that size, maybe a little bit bigger. And this nest that has been used for, we know, at least 35 years, maybe longer. I've met some folks that have actually been observing this nest for that long. And then from the bottom to the top is like 10 to 12 feet. To give you an idea of the size. These are huge nests. They keep building on year after year. You can always tell it to be utilized that particular season because they ordain it with fresh greenery from nearby trees. And I guess the other thing about this is when you look at the scale of the size of the nest, this is also 2,000 feet up on a vertical cliff face. Not a mammal predator, but an aerial predator with amazing significance. These are the bald eagles. I hear all the time that bald eagles are considered pretty rare in Yosemite. I've seen a lot of them, both in Merced River Canyon, not as much there, but in the high country, the mid-elevation lakes, and Tuolumne Meadows, and high elevation lakes. I see them very regularly, especially juvenile ones in the fall. That from that young of the year are moving on trying to find new areas. And so, I mean, we go to the fall in Tuolumne Meadows, along the Tuolumne River, almost every time I go up there, there's bald eagles. This is one that just caught a really large trout in the Merced River. This is just outside of the park in the Merced River Canyon, El Portal. I've always been fascinated by owls. One of the animals I've just spent as much time as anything else trying to photograph. These are barn owls. They're actually on our property in Groveland as well. This is also taken with an infrared setup, because it's at their nest. They want to disturb with the nest. We use that infrared setup. These are 3 juveniles that had left the nest. They go back during the day to roost in that spot, and every night they come back out to learn how to hunt from the adults, and they're fed. They just kind of keep them poking their heads out of their nest in a huge oak tree. What a slideshow again, Yosemite about the great gray owl. I do a whole slideshow on great gray owls. They're such amazing animals for so many different reasons. I'll just leave it at the biggest North American owl. The population that we have here in Yosemite in the foothills is an isolated population that hasn't been isolated for so long that they are their own species now. And among so many amazing adaptations, one of them is they've got a 5.5 foot wingspan. They're huge. They also have these specialized feathers on their wings that muffle the sound. So this huge bird could fly right by you within feet and you won't hear a sound. I've had it happen. And it's so bizarre because you're like, there's no way I can't hear this thing. It's so big. And it's just, it flies right by and it's incredibly impressive. And they funnel all the sound with a facial disc to their ears, primarily by sound rather than sight. And they're just extraordinary birds. Pygmy owl. So like the weasel, ounce for ounce, this is one of the toughest predators out there. Pygmy owls, will take prey twice their size. And the pygmy owl is like, we're talking, this tall. They're really small, but super aggressive. And I noticed in Yosemite Valley, they are lizard specialists. I think there are so many fence lizards that they find super easy to pick off when the lizards are sunning in the morning. I'll watch this pair catch like 10 lizards and bring it back to the nest. I'm going to leave you with a really, really cute fluff ball. This is a fledgling spotted owl that had just left the nest. And for some reason, it's really interesting that a lot of owls, the young leave the nest far before the time period they can fly. Most birds don't leave the nest until they have the ability to fly. But a lot of owl species, the young leave the nest, could be for a variety of reasons. Sometimes the nest gets infested with bugs and stuff like that and drive the young out. Could be some other reasons as well. But this was just hanging out on a rock in Yosemite Valley, super vulnerable. Right? It can't do anything to defend itself. Just looking cute. Fluff ball. That is it. So I don't know what the plan here now is, but maybe questions? I think Beth might come up and answer some questions if there are any.
How did you get that picture of the golden eagle if it was 2,000 feet up?
I was on again, this is work with the Park Service. They helped me out to find these spots. But there's a place that I could be on the neighboring wall, above the neighboring wall, looking down into the nest. I'm a long way away from it, like really long way away. I have a good enough telephoto lens that I could shoot at its full focal length and crop it to make it closer. It's a long way from the nest, which is great because it doesn't disturb them. One of the few places I've looked for long opportunities to have that, to be able to see in a golden eagle nest, is one of the ones I've ever seen. Very, very fortunate. I didn't rappel. I was able to be right at the top and just look down. I did do some rappelling for some golden or some prairie falcon, peregrine falcon images there in the book where I had to rappel off to be able to look down into their nest.
Is anybody interested in having him come back and talk some more, maybe in the spring?
I would love to. Other questions? Anything else? Yeah.
So some of those pictures of the owls look like it was at daytime. So they're not only at night?
Yeah, that's right. So gray owls are active during the day, especially dawn and dusk. Pygmy owls are active all during the day. Kind of the rare owls that are. All the other ones, like the one of the big spotted owls are only active at night. That one just happened to be out during the day, away from its nest. But generally, all those other owls are nocturnal. A few of them are active during the day. Yeah. How about a question for Beth? I've been talking a lot.
We know that Robb lives here. Where do you live, Beth?
I live over the hill in Mid-Pines, so I've lived there for almost 27 years now. So I worked in the park for a decade now, so very close. But Groveland has a special place in my heart for me because remember I told you in 1992, my first visit to Yosemite, I was living in Stockton at the time and I moved down here and to Groveland. This was my way in. I had many a drink at the Iron Door. I stayed at the Groveland Hotel and Hotel Shelters. So Groveland, I remember my first time going up and down Oak Creek Street. So Groveland was my first gateway.
All the gateway communities are amazing. These foothill communities just out of the park are really analogous. I don't know if you spent much time in the Mariposa, the Oakhurst areas, but really supportive foothill communities. She's from down there, and then obviously our communities up here. There's not as much interaction between the communities that there ought to be. Yeah. As the crow flies are close, we can zip line down there and get nice.
And Mid-Pines is the same out, so I'm at 3,000 feet, so it's almost, it's pretty analogous to Groveland.
That's those mountain lions. That's in your backyard.
Yeah, that was my backyard. I'm not a photographer. My trail cameras are really necessary ones, but I'm really proud that almost everything that should be in the Sierra I've caught on my cameras in the backyard, not my bears. The only thing I don't have is a terrible picture, but
Have you encountered the mountain lion up high country or?
That's a really great question. I've actually been looking, that's sort of my day job is mountain lions studying and working on mountain lions, especially in LA, but other areas. I actually have seen it, just did make the book. I was up in the Grand Divide and saw mountain lion tracks. That was about 11,005. For all the wanderings, I've been in that Gaylor Lakes circuit, and I do a 13-mile route, and I did, kind of Hirsch, and stuff. Never seen any sign, but on the other hand, doesn't surprise me, because mountain lions are kind of agoraphobic. They do not like open spaces. They're stealth predators, so that's not going to give them an advantage being in these wide open plains. In fact, there's some thought that's why we have mountain lions in North America, right? We used to have cheetahs, right, here, and the thought is when the Ice Age, the cheetahs kind of made it over the land bridge, and that's why we lost them. And we have the pronghorn, who literally is faster than anything since the cheetahs left. But at least the kind of fun theory is not too agoraphobic to make the journey, so we kept our lion. But yeah, I've never seen them up. I mean, I know they're there, we've tracked them, but it's not common for them to be that much in the open. So you probably see them more in that like tree line, to almost sundown.
And so that added that is, so I have not seen one. My camera traps have caught it times. I've seen sign lots of places. I've seen a bunch of sign in Tuolumne Meadows on the western end of Tuolumne Meadows. In those trees, there's a lot of deer. Over the years, I've seen a lot of lion sign there. And then this gentleman that we both know, Phil Johnson, who's preeminent lion tracker, lion biologist, has a great story of one of the ones that they had a collar on. It was on the east side of the Sierra, and then 2 days later it was over to Fresno. So they can move some distance. It's
25 miles
remarkable.
away. But yeah, they're just such an astounding creature, and I've had the good fortune to see them actually 6 times. I've been out to get some collars on, but yeah, they're not a high elevation specialist.
How do you put a collar on them?
Very carefully. Obviously tranquilized, yeah. Not only one.
So, a lot of people who live here catch mountain lions on their security cameras.
Yes.
Are those like all different lions, or is it maybe the same one coming through its territory?
Most likely the same. So mountain lions are solitary creatures. They're like me. They're the everybody thinks I'm an expert. I'm not. I'm good at being an expert, but I like to just be alone and be out there in the wild. And mountain lions are the same. They live alone. They're not in prides like Africa. And I just actually came back from Africa where you see 20 lions standing together. For the most part, mountain lions don't do that, except in some specific circumstances. And their territories are immense. It's like 100, 150, 200 square miles. It depends on the prey density. So you're likely seeing, what you have in an area is you'll have a dominant male, and then that may share territory with a couple of females. And then once the females give birth, you'll have the kittens. And since the mountain lion stay with their moms till they're about 1, sometimes even 2, they can look just as big as the mother. That's where you get people thinking there's like a pack of mountain lions. So you're probably seeing the same lion, either the male or the female. And it can be tricky to sex them, but like that video I showed at the end, it was the female with the kittens, and then there was a shot of the male. And the way you can usually tell it's a male, although you have to get the right angle, is there's a dark spot right under their tail. So you've probably seen the same line. I mean, I get this a lot as someone has to work with, preaching mountain lion coexistence. You're never going to have an overpopulation of mountain lions. They fight to the death over territory.
The only thing I might add to that is that, so Phil Johnson, the guy I was mentioning, had to teach a tracking workshop for a bunch of naturalist friends of mine out of our ranch at Red Tail. And we were talking much about that. The only thing he added to that was that all the times they will have slight overlapping portions of their territory. And one will make a big loop of this territory, the other might have another incursion into that territory. So, because we were talking about that specific question about our property and around here, his thought was that it can be just a different time frame of that slight overlap, like a Venn diagram, where those territories overlap, and so it could be possibly some differentiation.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, like even I mean, they're not like, it's not like states where they don't adhere to the boundaries. So, yeah, if you had like, two males and then you happen to be like in the four corners of the states where like their territories are good, but it's, I mean, even, yeah, I mean, it's just, you're not going to be seeing a variety of different apps. And I will add that some of the research, especially coming out of the Rockies, it is interesting. They are finding, at least the theory now, is where there are multiple predators they have to compete with, like in Yellowstone, there's grizzlies, wolves. Mountain lions are starting to share a little bit, which is really interesting to me.
Can you give us a quick update on the crossing?
Oh, the wildlife crossing I work on, year out from completion. We just started stage 2B. Ribbon cutting next November, and I can finally take a nap. But it's been really exciting. And we're starting to work on crossings in the Sierra and looking at them. So it's been exciting.
Woohoo!
Woohoo! Yeah. Do you want to start? Yeah, we will sign book.
I think I have one more question.
Oh, sorry.
I have one more
I
question.
was going to ask, what's next? This is 30 years to get to this book. I know you've got the projects, the crossing, all of that. What's your next big goal?
I actually have been thinking about it. I could write a whole book on the pika. I mean, it's just, but, I also was thinking there's one of my favorite books is one of the Beetle Rocks. I referenced it in the book, which was written about Peace Camp, where this naturalist, Sarah, just talks about all the animals in the day in their life on Beetle Rock. And Yellow Lake is the place on that most, so I was thinking about doing one of those. But nothing big. And I'm sure Robb is probably the same. Aren't you just like, okay, I don't have the pressure. I can just go out and take a photo and see wildlife.
There was a period where the end of the book where bird could not fly by.
Yeah.
Oh my God, why that to the book?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it changed my psyche. And so it's nice to drop that and
Yeah.
not have that thing.
It's
But
nice.
then, at the same time, I have to think about next book. Like the owl book is a buddy of mine, is an owl biologist. So I just sent considered that. And my other thing I'd really like to at some point is the book committed to, wilderness, however you describe it, it's kind of a tough word, but just, basically, just everybody goes to Yosemite Valley. Yosemite Valley is 5% of the entire park. Why do we need to preserve all of that land, right? And so have images of the wilderness, but then essays and writings that talk about why do we need that space? Clearing the water, cleaning the air, all those cycles, as well as the human psychology, how we know now that it's good for humans to be in nature. It's not just hearsay, there's actually science behind it. And tie in all that stuff, not sort of spiritual stuff. There's really some hands-on, really beneficial things. So it's not just a self-fulfilling prophecy. I like being in nature, I feel better. No, actually there's rationale behind it. And to have a book that helps explain that kind of stuff is something I'd like to do.
But yeah, it's nice to just, like, I went out after the book was out and see pika to write about this. I'm sure about it.
Before we wrap up here, thank you all again for coming. I want to acknowledge all our docents who are here tonight, people that keep the museum open. We're open Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from 10 until 2. And you can buy Robb's earlier book in our museum.
And we'll stay inside, we're here, so.
Yeah.
And chat, we like talking.
Yeah.
Thank you all for
Thank
coming.
you.